In 1787, delegates from each of the 13 states were invited to Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation in hopes of strengthening the central government. 55 representatives from 12 of the 13 states met from May to September of that year. Only Rhode Island sent no delegates. Connecticut sent 3: Roger Sherman, Oliver Ellsworth, and William Samuel Johnson. Delegates at Philadelphia did not amend the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they wrote a new document, the Constitution of the United States. 1787 was 11 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and just 6 years after the end of the Revolutionary War. This reenactment deals with some of the debate about the United States Constitution, including what has been named the Connecticut Compromise. On May 29, 1787, Edmund Randolph of Virginia proposed a plan, later characterized as the Virginia Plan, dealing with the makeup of our national legislature.
This convention is called to order. The chair recognizes Mr. Edmund Randolph, delegate of Virginia.
Gentlemen, as this is our second day of business, I feel compelled to open the subject of our mission. I regret that it falls upon myself, rather than my colleagues, who are of longer life and political experience. However, as this convention originated from Virginia, from which I have been sent, my colleagues there supposed that some proposition was expected from the Virginia delegation, and the task was subsequently put upon me. These United States of America have seen a crisis unfold, necessitating action in order to prevent the fulfillment of the prophecies of our downfall. We propose, therefore, among other resolutions, the following. Resolved that the national legislature ought to consist of 2 branches. Resolved that the members of the first branch of the national legislature ought to be elected by the people of the several states. Resolved that the members of the second branch of the national legislature ought to be elected by those of the first, out of a proper number of persons nominated by the individual legislatures.
What you have just heard was the first proposal for the setup of a bicameral or 2-house legislature, and some of the details of that arrangement. This proposal caused a great disagreement among the convention delegates. The Virginia plan proposed that the states have a number of representatives in the legislature based on their population, but counting only free inhabitants, not including slaves. The plan called for the first branch to have its representatives elected by the people. The second branch was to be elected by representatives of the first branch.
Be it resolved that the House will tomorrow resolve itself into a committee of the whole House to consider the state of the American Union, and that the proposition moved by Mr. Randolph be referred to the said committee. This convention stands adjourned.
On May 30th, Roger Sherman, a Connecticut delegate, took a seat. The House went into Committee of the Whole on the State of the Union. The following parts of the discussion concern the issue of how to determine how many representatives each state gets in the legislature. The larger states want representation based on population, and of course, the small states object to that plan. Nobody has yet suggested anything about non-free inhabitants or slaves. The Committee of the Whole began by discussing Resolution 2 of Mr. Randolph's proposition, that the rights of suffrage in the national legislature ought to be proportioned to the quotas of contribution and to the number of free inhabitants.
Mr. Chairman, James Madison from the Commonwealth of Virginia. The words, "or to the number of free inhabitants," might occasion debates which would divert this committee from the general question whether the principle of representation should be changed. Therefore, I move that they be struck out.
The resolution was then postponed. This procedure happened quite often in the Committee of the Whole. There were several parts of all propositions that were put aside due to an inability to agree on specific language. Rather than continuing debate on a topic, it was simply delayed in an attempt to make headway on other topics. It is now Thursday, May 31st. We are in the Committee of the Whole discussing Edmund Randolph's propositions as to how representatives should be chosen. The third resolution was that the national legislature ought to consist of 2 branches. That was agreed to without debate or dissent, except for the representative from Pennsylvania, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who was in favor of a single house of legislation. The committee then turned to Resolution 4-2 and its first clause, that the members of the first branch of the national legislature ought to be elected by the people of the several states. Roger Sherman, among others, felt that the citizens could not be trusted to elect proper representatives and that they would be too easily influenced by inaccurate information. Isn't it interesting how often we hear comments like that today?
I am opposed to the election by the people. It ought to be by the state legislatures. The people should have as little to do with the operation of government as possible. They want for information and are constantly liable of being misled.
Mr. Chairman, Colonel George Mason of Virginia, I urge strongly for an election of the larger branch by the people. It is to be the grand depository of the democratic principle of the government. It is, so to speak, to be our House of Commons. It ought to know and sympathize with every part of the community, and ought therefore to be taken not only from the whole republic, but from the different parts of the larger members of the same, which have, in several instances, differences, particularly in Virginia, arising from different interests and views, from different produce and habits, etc. We ought to attend to the rights of every class of people.
I consider the popular election of one branch of the national legislature an essential to every plan of free government. In some of the states, one branch of the legislature is composed of men already removed from the people by an intervening body of electors. That if the first branch of the general legislature should be elected by the state legislatures, the second branch elected by the first, the executive by the second together with the first, and other appointments again made for subordinate purposes by the executive, the people would be lost sight of altogether, and the necessary sympathy between them and their rules and offices too little felt. The great fabric to be raised would be far more stable and durable if it should rest on the solid foundation of the people themselves than if it should stand merely on the pillars of the legislature.
There were 8 votes in favor and 3 opposed. The committee then proceeds to Resolution 5-4, that the second branch of the national legislature ought to be chosen by the first branch out of persons nominated by the state legislatures.
If I was to give an opinion as to the size of the second branch, I should say that it should be much smaller than that of the first, so small as to be exempt from the passionate proceedings to which such numerous assemblies are liable.
I strongly favor the election of one member by each of the state legislatures.
After a quick tally with only 1 supporting vote, the motion failed, as did the idea of electing the first branch out of nominations by the state legislatures. Due to great disagreement, this part of the plan was left unresolved. The House adjourned until Wednesday, June 6th, when the debate continued. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina moved that the first branch of the national legislature be selected by the state legislatures and not by the people. Pinckney believed legislators would make better choices than the average person would. That motion was seconded. The debate continued with other delegates commenting, and then Roger Sherman of Connecticut weighed in.
If the view were to abolish the state legislatures, then I would favor popular election by the people. But if the state governments are to be maintained, then in order to keep the due harmony between the national government and the state government, it is essential that the latter be elected by the former. The right of the people to participate in the government will be properly secured by their election of the state legislatures.
Under the existing Confederacy, Congress represents the states, not the people. their acts operate on the states, not the individuals. The case will be changed in the new form of government. The people will be represented. They ought, therefore, to choose their representatives. The requisites of representation are that the representatives should sympathize with their constituents, should think as they think and feel as they feel, and that for these purposes should live amongst them. No government is free from imperfections or evils, but the improper elections in many instances are inseparable from Republican governments. But compare these with the advantage of this form in favor of the rights of people, in favor of human nature. There is a better chance of proper elections by the people, if divided in large districts, than by the state legislature.
An election of one branch at least of the national legislature by the people immediately as a clear principle. A free government under proper regulation has the advantage of securing better representatives, as well as avoiding too great an agency of the state governments in the general one.
The question was called for electing the first branch by the state legislatures. The motion was defeated and the House adjourned. Still, there is no decision made on the manner of choosing representatives. The committee returned to this issue on June 7th, when it was moved that the members of the second branch ought to be chosen by the individual legislatures. Roger Sherman seconded that motion.
The particular states would thus become interested in supporting the national government, and a due harmony between the two would be maintained. Now, the two ought to have separate and distinct jurisdictions, but they ought to have a mutual interest in supporting each other.
The true question is in what mode the best choice may be made. If an election by the people or through any other channel than the state legislatures promises as uncorrupt and impartial a preference of merit, there can surely be no necessity for an appointment by those legislatures. Nor is it apparent that a more useful check would be derived through that channel than through the people or some other. The great evil complained of has been that the state legislatures run into schemes of paper money whenever solicited by the people, and sometimes without even the sanction of the people. Their influence, then, instead of checking a like propensity in the national legislature, may be expected to promote it. Gentlemen, nothing could be more contradictory than to say that the national legislature, without a proper check, will follow the example of the state legislatures, and in the same breath that the state legislatures are the only proper check.
I oppose election by the people in districts as not as likely to produce fit men as elections by the state legislatures.
A number of delegates believed that representatives to the federal government should be selected by people of prominence who had wealth and property. Their intent was to make this new body as similar as possible to the British House of Lords. It was further argued that these individuals should be selected by the state legislatures and that their number did not matter. As one delegate stated, if their number should be small, the popular branch could not be balanced by them. The legislature of a numerous people ought to be a numerous body. You might be surprised to learn that Connecticut maintained an elite upper house until 1818, well after this convention ended. A motion by John Dickinson of Delaware for an appointment of the Senate by the state legislatures was called and passed. On June 11th, the clause concerning the rule of representation in the national legislature was resumed. That's when Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed what is now called the Connecticut Compromise. This proposal solves the issue between the larger and smaller states regarding representation in the legislature. Edmund Randolph had proposed the Virginia Plan that called for representation based on population, and the smaller states had proposed an alternative called the New Jersey Plan, where each state would have equal representation. Roger Sherman proposed another way to settle the dispute.
I propose that the proportion of suffrage in the first branch should be according to the respective numbers of free inhabitants, and that in the second branch, the Senate, each state should have one vote and no more. As the states would remain possessed of certain interests, they would be able to protect those interests. Otherwise, a few large states would be able to rule the rest. In England, the House of Lords is possessed of certain rights under the Constitution, and it has an equal vote with the House of Commons in order to protect those rights.
Other delegates argued that the number of representatives should be proportional to each state's wealth, since money is power. Taking up Roger Sherman's cause, Rufus King from Massachusetts proposed that the members of the first branch, now known as the House of Representatives, should be determined in a more fair way, such as by population. At this point, the oldest member of the convention, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, rises to speak about the benefits of compromise and working together.
Gentlemen, it has given me much pleasure to observe that till this point, the proportion of representation came before us. Our debates were carried on with great coolness and temper. If anything of a contrary kind has on this occasion appeared, I hope it will not be repeated. For we are sent to consult, not to contend with each other, and declarations of a fixed opinion and of determined resolution never to change it, neither enlighten nor convince us. Positiveness and warmth on the one side naturally beget their like on the other, and tend to create and augment discord and division in a great concern wherein harmony and union are extremely necessary to give weight to our counsels and render them effectual in promoting and securing the common good. I must own that I was of the opinion that it would be better if every member of Congress or our National Council were to consider himself rather as a representative of the whole rather than an agent for the interests of a particular state, in which case the proportion of members to each state would be of less consequence, and it would not be material whether they voted by states or individually. But as I find that this is not to be expected, I now think the number of representatives should bear some proportion to the number of the represented, and that the decisions should be by the majority of the members, not the majority of states. This is objected to from an apprehension that the greater states would then swallow up the smaller. I do not, at present, clearly see what advantage the greater states could propose to themselves by swallowing the smaller, and therefore do not apprehend that they would attempt it. But, sir, in the present mode of voting by the states, it is equally in the power of the lesser states to swallow up the greater. The greater states, sir, are naturally as unwilling to have their property left in the disposition of the smaller as the smaller are to have theirs in the disposition of the greater. An honorable gentleman has, to avoid this difficulty, hinted a proposition of equalizing the states. It appears to me to be an equitable one, and I should, for my own part, not be against such a measure if it might be found practicable.
I move that the question be taken whether each state shall have one vote in the second branch. Everything depends on this. The smaller states will accept no other proportion of suffrage than an equal vote in the second branch.
In the end, Roger Sherman's Connecticut Compromise won the day. So today, we have the two houses, a bicameral legislature that we call Congress. In the House, each state has a number of representatives based on the state's population. In the Senate, each state has an equal number of 2 representatives. satisfying both the large and small states and resolving one of the main issues of the Constitutional Convention of 1787.